We're here this morning, today, to talk about heroes. Heroes? Like who? Well, like you, or you, or you, or you. In fact, in my book, every one of y'all are heroes. Why do I say that? Well, what is the definition of a hero? The definition that I like is a person who stands up against an irresistible foe, and they may, in fact, be a little scared, but they decide, I'm going to resist anyway, because it's the right thing to do. Like this guy, for example. I think we all remember back in 1989, throughout the month of May of 1989 and the early part of June, there were student protests in Beijing. The students were protesting in Tiananmen Square to get basic rights that we may take for granted. Well, the government, of course, decided this is intolerable. So they sent in tanks to put down the rebellion. And in fact, hundreds of protesters were killed during May and early June. And then on June 5th, at least one young man stood up in front of the tanks. He said, enough is enough. Now, this young man, was he facing an irresistible foe? Yeah. I mean, he was armed with nothing but a shopping bag, and they had tanks. So it was an irresistible foe. And was he scared? Well, I wasn't there, so I don't know. But about 3 months ago, my family and I were standing in Tiananmen Square, very close to where he was. And I can tell you, even today, 20 years later, and with us being tourists, so there's no way they were going to hurt us, it was a little bit intimidating. You could look around, you could see soldiers. They'd be marching in formation, anywhere from 2 to sometimes 20 or 30 soldiers marching together. And there'd be military equipment. Now, we didn't see any tanks, but we would see other things. And so, yeah, I can tell you, to us, even, it was intimidating. So I can only imagine what it felt like to this young man. But he decided it was the right thing to do, and as a result, he made history. Now, in the same way, you all are sitting here today, and you're also facing an apparently irresistible foe. This is just a brief summary of some of the cyber crimes that have happened in the last couple years. It's not completely up to date. I mean, I could take a full-time job just updating this summary. But I just wanted to point out a couple of incidents on there. At the top here, we have an incident of hacktivism in the Philippines where somebody decided that he didn't like the security in the voting system, and so he did what any of us would do. He stole 55 million pieces of information on his fellow countrymen and released it to the internet, of course. Yahoo! I was just reading about this yesterday morning. Over the last couple years, the more and more information has come to light that, according to the article I read yesterday, they said every single Yahoo account has now been hacked and released onto the public internet. Every single one, 3 billion accounts. Anybody going, oh, I better go check, because that's what I'm thinking. And finally, something I'm going to be talking about later was the Swift financial messaging system. And there's a good lesson here that I'll be talking about a little later. Who am I? I'm Gary Bisaga. I am an architect for PowerSchool. If you have seen this, and if you've seen anything done by PowerSchool recently, I'm sure you've seen this diagram because we use it everywhere. But I like it because it kind of shows the things that I've been working on over the last 8 years I've been with PowerSchool. From the 70 countries, I was the architect for the internationalization project. Anybody who's done any translation of PowerSchool or anything, that was our work. It's a lot of fun. I've gotten to work with a lot of districts. Anybody here have a customized version of PowerSchool where you install plugins? Yeah? Awesome. I've done quite a bit of work with plugins, wrote a lot of that code originally. One of my patents is in the area of customization, page fragments. You may be familiar with those. And I've gotten to work with a lot of partners, which has been it's been a great blessing to me. The partners we have here today, like Edgenuity in the back there, just great folks that really work well with PowerSchool and really help it to work better with your district's needs. So it's been a great blessing the last 8 years to work with all these different talented people. So what we're going to do today, though, is we're going to talk about some FAQs. Now, we all know what FAQ stands for, right? Frequently avoided questions. Not because we don't want to ask them, but we're just not thinking about it. I like what Matt was talking about, that a lot of times we're not thinking about security as much as we should be. And this is going to be kind of a theme as we look through this. We're all interested in doing our jobs, right? Does anybody have more and more work to do with less and less resources? Yeah, I think that hits everybody. And so security is sometimes the last thing we think about. So we need people like security architects and security officers to keep it in front of us. We need people like Matt Brodacki to keep it in front of us. So we're going to look at a couple of frequently avoided questions today. And some of these questions are questions that you should be asking your software vendor. Do you do these things? Are these things that you consider important as a vendor? Some of these questions should be asked to whoever is doing the deployment. If you're using PowerSchool service, software as a service or our hosting, ask us. If you're doing hosting yourself, if you're running your own servers, ask them of yourself. And some of these questions are for both. So let's get into the first one. What security qualifications does your Chief Information Security Officer hold? Now, unfortunately, the answer to that too many times is, what Chief Information Security Officer? Right? It's a position that a lot of people don't even have. But I think it's really important, and the main reason is what I just said a minute ago, and what Matt was trying to drive home, which is we're not always thinking about security. Even us in development, we're not always thinking about security. And I'll give you some examples of that later. So we need somebody at a level with teeth to bring these things home. Have you ever been in this situation where you have somebody who's writing something like a security policy? These are the things that everybody has to do, and they get done with it, and they put it out there, and everybody agrees, this is great, high fives all around, awesome. And then, crickets. Nobody ever looks at it. Because the problem is, we're so busy doing our jobs. We don't have time to look at this. So you really need somebody in that kind of a high position to make sure that the policies have teeth. Second question, have vendors taken the privacy pledge? I'm sure that you've read about this. It really says that we'll be responsible for taking care of your data. And I love the way it's worded, where it says, we're honored to be entrusted with this information. Because it really is an honor to be entrusted with holding on to the information. And it's something that we at PowerSchool, and it's not only PowerSchool, I know that our other vendors take it just as seriously. So that's a question to ask. Now, obviously, just because somebody doesn't sign the pledge doesn't mean that they're going to be irresponsible with your data. But I can tell you that I'm a programmer, basically. Okay? I call myself an architect, but I'm really a programmer. And I can tell you that we have had run-ins, I will say, with our own legal group. Because they want to make sure that we're not doing anything that could possibly violate this pledge. Not that we would ever want to, but we had a discussion with our head lawyer a little while back. We wanted to pass some student data into our unified classroom cloud. And they said, oh, no, you can't pass that data. And we said, but we have to pass the data. And we demonstrated exactly how we're keeping it secure. And eventually they said, okay, looks fine. But it was something that the lawyers, as much as we all love them, they were keeping us honest. And so the privacy pledge, I think it's a great thing. Another thing is, do you have a written security policy? Tell me if you've ever been in this kind of a situation. The programmer delivers his software, maybe to a manager, to a QA person, and he says, there you go, it's done. The manager tries it out for a while, and he says, "Oh no, you're not done yet. Your software isn't secure." Programmer says, "What do you mean? Of course it's secure. I worked on it. I put all these security features in there." Manager says, No. Seems to me it should have this security feature too." Well, here's my question for you. Which of these two guys is right? Or two women, whichever. I don't mean to be discriminatory. Which of these two is right? Well, the fact is, this is a trick question. Because from the information I've given you, we don't know which is right. It all depends on what is the security policy. Because the security policy is what defines what mechanisms are required. If a mechanism implements the policy, it's secure. If it doesn't, it's not. It also ensures that the security is there. It also keeps you from doing over-implementation. Now you might ask, how can it be too secure? Well, it's not a fact of being too secure. It's a fact of having too much mechanism that implements restrictions or is too expensive. I once worked with the government of a state which is fairly near to here. I don't want to go into it any more than that. Good folks though. But in one of the persons at the state, they were saying, only this person can have access to this data. Well, we looked at that and we said, is it really true that nobody other than that person can ever have access to that data? And they said, oh no, well about 20% of the time, somebody else needs to handle it. See, if we hadn't asked the specific question and gotten it down in the policy, what was security and what wasn't, 20% of the time, they'd be out of luck. And they'd have to go back and re-implement it. It would have been more expensive. So it's important to limit the mechanism to what you really need. And finally, it's important to write an acceptable use policy. I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but acceptable use policies are hugely important. One of the biggest security leaks is when people come along and maybe plug a memory stick into a computer that may be infected. Now the computer's infected. Well, in your acceptable use policy, you'll have things like what you can plug into computers and what you can't plug into computers. It's important to train the users so that they know how to keep the system secure. Another question, does your policy match your legal obligations? There's a number of legal obligations out there. I think everybody in the ed tech industry is familiar with a little regulation called FERPA. This is the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. Any student-related system has to deal with this. There's also HIPAA that sometimes comes in, and here in Connecticut you have a specific clause that's put into contracts to help to define what is secure and what isn't secure. So any policy needs to take these into account as well. A good question to always ask, do you sell or misuse personal data? Obviously, the right answer is no. It was interesting, I saw about 2 years back, somebody wrote an article where they were opining about how they were afraid that PowerSchool was now going to take your student data and was going to use it in nefarious ways, maybe to pump advertising targeted at students or something like that. Well, I can tell you, it ain't true. I mean, we're not perfect, okay? Infinite Campus can tell you about that. We're not perfect, but I tell you, this is something that would never happen. I hope my example of the lawyers is a good indication of that. There's no way that this would ever happen. Do you protect the data that you do store? Obviously, the right answer is yes. But again, this is the kind of thing that we need to focus on. I told you before that I'm basically a developer, architect. I made a little plaque for my wall. And my plaque says, remember, programmers are careless and naive, and users are smart, malicious, and have all the source code. Now, that's obviously not true for all programmers, and certainly not true for all users. But I find that having this plaque on the wall really keeps my mind on what really needs to be in the system. It really needs to enforce access control. It needs to be suspicious of data that you get in. Matt before talked about the things like cross-site scripting, things that are in the OWASP top 10. These are all things that we need to keep in mind, and I'm going to be talking a little bit later about processes that are important in development of software. Another question. Do you limit access to production data? Do you limit it to people with appropriate roles, who are background checked? The main idea here is to make sure that administrators and owners don't own the system. Okay, this is a key distinction, and it's something that has to be kept in front of us all the time. In fact, if you've never done software development, it's a perfectly natural result for all programmers, all QA people, all managers, and all administrators to have full access to the data. That's the natural result. Okay, but just like with kids, following their natural results is not always the best thing for them. What we need to do, it's perfectly all right to have access to test data, which you need to develop the system. But then when you go to production data, you have to be very intentional about blocking people from access who shouldn't have access to it. And so, for example, I can tell you, within PowerSchool, we have processes set up that, quite honestly, sometimes are a pain in the neck. If we need to get access to production data, let's say to check on some situation, we can't just go in there and log on to the system and take a look at it. We have to have a JIRA ticket in there, which is our issue tracking system. It has to be approved by security. We then have to go on and get a limited time use access token that we can connect to the system, and everything that we do on there is logged and audited. It can be a pain sometimes. But the point is, we need to make sure that we don't own the data. Everybody has to understand that. The data is yours. Data is yours, and it belongs to your students and your parents and your teachers. We are just the stewards of it, I should say. Another question. How do you keep out unauthorized users? Well, typically the idea is sometimes called defense in depth, defense in depth, or sometimes it's called the castle principle. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have a big background on castles. But I was reading about them a little while back, and they're fascinating. It's not just a wall with maybe a moat around it. There'd be outer curtain walls, they call them. Sometimes they'd be many feet thick of stone. And then within that, they'd have a moat, and then they'd have an outer wall, and then they'd have an inner wall, and then finally, all the way in the middle is where the royalty would be. It was this multiple layer kind of an idea. And that's exactly the same situation that we want to have with our systems and with our networks, these multiple layers. We need to keep out network access. We need to make sure that we have that outer curtain wall in there, that if you're not authorized, you can't get network access. And I just explained an example of the way that we do keep people out. You need to have whitelist of IP addresses. So in other words, you can't just get into the network from anywhere. It has to be from a location that's physically and networkologically controlled. You want to have intrusion detection, because as much as we try, there could always be somebody who gets past all the defenses. We need that sentinel standing up on the tower of the castle saying, there are invaders here. So we need the intrusion detection systems, and finally we need to be able to push them out through a call tree, make sure we can implement countermeasures. The first part of the castle, though, is the perimeter defense around the outside. Firewall is typically what we use. We all know about firewalls. But I just want to say a couple things about firewalls. One is we need to try to make sure that the rules in firewalls are simple. I've seen over the years that I've been working in software and networking, I've seen problems with access and security problems, not because somebody didn't try to set up the firewall, but because they tried too hard. There's a lot of complicated configurations and if-then chains and things like that. So it's important to keep the firewall rules simple as you can. No simpler, obviously, but as simple as you can. And then make sure that there's minimum access. A lot of this has to do with shutting down ports. If you have a server, and servers typically come with a whole bunch of ports open, a whole bunch of services. If you don't need them, shut them down. And maybe even double block them through the firewall. But the firewall isn't sufficient. We may look at it and say, well, my system must be secure because I have a firewall, right? Well, I think it's instructive to look back at castles for a minute. In the early days of castles, the most vulnerable position was the door, right? Because you have this big wooden door, but if somebody comes along with a battering ram or with flames, they can burn the door down. And so what they would do in castles is they built something called a gatehouse. And a gatehouse was a truly nasty little building that was the only way into the castle. And in these gatehouses, they would have things like multiple steel iron portcullises to block people, and they'd have things like spikes sticking up with poison on them, and they'd have little holes in the roof that they could pour boiling water or oil down through, little holes affectionately called murder holes. The part of the system that was the most vulnerable became the most strongly fortified. And so what did the attackers do? They said, I'm not going to go after the gate anymore. The gatehouse is not worth it. So we're going to find other ways in. So they did very inventive things, like they'd walk around and they'd dig out under the corner of the castle so that the castle would actually fall over. So they found other ways in, is the point. And that's exactly what can happen. We have to look at security as not just a firewall, but as an entire system. Make sure, for example, that you have things in different virtual private clouds in AWS, for example, that you have security groups, that you have network access, that you have all these things that can all work together to keep the bad guys out. But it's not enough to just protect the data. You also have to make it available when it's needed. Because if this data is not available, obviously the system's not any good to anybody. So this is another question that we should ask of a vendor, for example. Are you prepared for disasters? Are you taking regular backups? Do you have systems set up to quickly reestablish business? Warm standbys, the ability to come right back. Hugely important. Unfortunately, when we're so busy with our everyday jobs, we can forget about this. Another thing, DOS and DDoS mitigation. This is something that Matt talked about a little bit. What are these? Denial of service and distributed denial of service mitigation. These two things sound an awful lot alike, but I like to differentiate it this way. It's not a perfect definition, but I think most of the time it works. That a DOS, a denial of service, is a case where the attacker takes advantage of a fault in the software. Whereas a distributed denial of service, there's no fault in the software. The attacker just comes along with lots and lots of systems and throws all kinds of junk at the system, and eventually they break it down. These two are both super important. And I can tell you that in PowerSchool, this is just our PowerSchool example. I know other vendors have similar processes in place. On the denial of service side, we have regular security reviews that I'll be talking about that will go through and look at the system to see if there are cracks that attackers can get in and have denial of service. On the DDoS side, in PowerSchool hosting, we use a DDoS mitigation vendor that I think has been very effective. We mentioned a DDoS attack just a little while back. I actually remember the Shelton, I believe. I actually remember when that attack was going on. And we were watching what was coming in. It's like, wow. Well, the good thing is now we have DDoS mitigation in there. We've actually worked closely with the DDoS mitigation vendor to integrate it better with the systems. And I think it's been doing a really great job. Upgrading and patching. This seems like the most boring thing in the world, to me anyway. I mean, I'm a developer, I'm not an administrator. So this seems really boring to me. But this is another one of those things. It's just hugely important. And if you're going to be running the system on your own, this is something that you really have to pay a lot of attention to. Imagine this kind of a scenario where your boss comes in and they say, so the system just went down. And you say, yep, I'm working to get it back up. They say, well, is there a patch to take care of this? And you say, well, there is. It came out about a month ago, but I just haven't had time to install it. Wouldn't be good. And so it's really important to keep up with operating system patches, to keep up with application upgrades. And one thing that's easy to miss is to make sure that all dependencies are also upgraded. The architecture team that I'm part of, we used to be responsible within the PowerSchool SIS for making sure that all of our dependent libraries were kept up to date and that all security vulnerabilities were found. Let me tell you, that was not a fun job. But it was something that was very, very necessary. Now I'm happy to say we use a vendor called Black Duck that makes sure that all of our dependencies, it checks all the version. All I have to do is drop the software in there, it analyzes the software, and it says, here's all your libraries, here's the ones that need to be updated. So it's a huge help, and it's something that, quite honestly, if you're doing it on your own, it's a lot of work. You also want to verify that connected systems are keeping the data just as safe as you are. I've gotten the opportunity to work with a lot of our partners over the last couple of years. And I love working with partners. Partners are great folks and really help to make the system more useful for you. But this is one of the things that we always have to talk about, is are you implementing the same level of security as the PowerSchool system itself? And on a few minor occasions, I've had to talk to the partners and say, okay, we need to modify how you're dealing with this information to make sure that there's not a possible information leak there. And you also have to know where the sensitive data is and be transparent to the administrators. So that's one thing. If you use the plugin console, you'll see that you can look at each plugin and you can see what data they have access to. So we want to be transparent about that. And on my original slide there, where I talked about the various attacks in the last couple years, that attack on the SWIFT financial network, remember that? Where there was $81 million stolen? What's interesting about it is it was not an attack on the SWIFT network itself. It was an attack on one of the bank systems that was connected to the SWIFT network. And so because of that compromised system, they were able to steal $81 million. So it's hugely important to make sure that not only the basic system is secure, but also any system that it's connected to is secure. So, how do you know that the system really is secure? Is there some sort of independent verification? And the answer is, yes, there is. There are actually a few of these. I mentioned two of them, ISO 27001 and SOC 2. I know there's a few others, but quite honestly, I am not an expert in this area. I don't know about all the different standards. But I do know that it's hugely important to be independently verified. We need to verify, for example, that the vendors are developing their software securely, that you have processes that make sure that security bugs can't accidentally find their way in. I'll be talking about those a little bit. You need to make sure that wherever you're deploying the software, you deploy it securely. You have to make sure that there's limited network access, like I talked about, that you have well-configured firewalls, that you have DDoS protection, all these types of things. You need to make sure that there's disaster recovery, because again, it's no good to just have the software in there and have the data in there if nobody can access it. And to make sure that it's independently verified by a third party, because we all want to do a great job, but we all know that sometimes we're building something and somebody comes along and says, maybe you should take a look at that. That's why we have design reviews, and that's why we have third-party independent. And I'm happy to say that PowerSchool, as of not today, but I believe within the next month or so, we expect to be finishing our ISO 27001 certification. So will we be independently verified at that point? What does an ISO certification consist of? Well, it consists of a lot of things, but I want to talk about a few things. And one of the reasons I'm talking about these are the things that I know the most about, being a software developer. One of them is source code verification. There can be all kinds of problems in source code, and it's good, as I said, to have a third party take a look at it. And we do have source code verification, both at two levels. We have static and dynamic. The static is we run it through a tool called SonarQube, which goes through and looks over the code and it evaluates it for possible problems. And we also have dynamic. We have an independent third party called White Hat that goes in and evaluates the code for vulnerabilities. We also check out library vulnerabilities. As I said, we used to do this by hand, and it was a lot of work. Now, though, we have a service that we use called Black Duck that goes through and evaluates open source libraries and commercial libraries to find, are there any security holes in the versions that you're using? And then it gives us recommendations about how to update it. And then finally, regular penetration testing, something else that Matt talked about. It's important to have. You hope that you're not going to have anything happen, but sometimes you do, and it's very instructive. And I've actually been happy sometimes to see pen testing results that showed some vulnerability. Because, you know, it's a lot like cockroaches. Just because the light's not on doesn't mean they're not there. So it's good to know about these things. So we'll need to have regular pen testing. You also have to have a software process that supports security. As I said, we as developers, users, managers, we're not thinking about security all the time. And so it's important to have your process support it. You need to be able to do things like constantly assess against common vulnerabilities. One of the best known lists is from OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project. They publish their top 10 every year, but they also have lots of other information on their website, owasp.org, highly recommended. We regularly go through. Every single ticket we have has to pass muster against these criteria. There are also certain areas of the application that we found that require special scrutiny, like things that are security related, or things that have maybe tentacles into other parts of the system. We've learned that these things have to have no-fly zones, and so before going in and modifying them, you actually have to raise it up a level and bring it in front of the architecture board, of which I'm a part. And finally, you need to have a project architect, me, for a number of projects, not for all of them, but for some of them, to evaluate each ticket and say, yes, it looks like there's no security risk here, or there is a security risk, and so we need to investigate it further. And finally, as much as you want to try to avoid it, and we do try to avoid it, there are going to be security problems that slip through. So it's important for your vendor to have a dedicated security maintenance team. We have a team that's just dedicated to fixing these problems. And unfortunately, they have work to do. It would be nice to say they never did, but they do occasionally have work to do. They do other work as well, but they do a lot of security work. So these are all important things to have. So the next question that you should ask is, are we going to be able to do this all ourselves? Are we going to be able to make sure that all the firewalls are taken care of and all the network access rules are set in and all that sort of a thing? And maybe the answer is yes. I mean, we have many customers who have securely implemented systems. But as I hope I've tried to show, there's a lot involved there. We do publish security best practices. If you go onto PowerSource, the support site, you'll find a set of security best practices that we publish. And if you want to go on your own, that's great. Go ahead and download those security practices and make sure that you're implementing all of them. But especially for smaller districts, not just smaller districts, but especially for smaller districts, it can be hard to find people to do all those things. Like I said, they're already busy doing their normal jobs. And so we offer several levels of support. The highest level of support is software as a service. Here it's completely turnkey. I was just talking to some folks from Norwalk this morning where they have software as a service. They were able to pass it on all over to us, and we take care of all the problems. So we'll look in there and make sure make sure it's on a network that's enterprise grade, that has the right security controls in place, that has the right monitoring. Oh, I have to talk about this. I love monitoring. Monitoring is so cool. I've recently gotten the opportunity to use some of the monitoring tools that our hosting team, our DevOps team uses themselves, and they are so cool, at least to a geek like me. They're really cool. You can see what's going on in the system, and you can see how many messages are being passed per second, and you can see what the delay is in the Kafka queues, and thank you. Glad to get that out of my system. But they have a lot of great monitoring tools out there. And so a lot of people will choose to go with software as a service. I think about half of our customers are now going with software as a service. And I think it's a great service. I know all the folks over there, and they do a great job at it. But maybe you have rules. Maybe you have to have the hardware in your own facility. Maybe there's some regulatory reason or something. So for that, we also offer the enterprise management. And here, we do the same types of management. We have the same kinds of monitoring and the same types of upgrade support and all those sorts of things, but it's on your hardware. A lot of people have found that that works well for them. Another option is security advisory service. And here now, we're not doing the work, but what we'll do is we'll come in either on a one-time basis or we can do it periodically and just evaluate your system. Is it secure? Is it performant? Do you have the proper backups and hot standbys in place? And then we offer database and security consulting services to help you do the job right. And finally, there is a SSL certificate administration, just because the certificates are really important to get right, and so we make sure that they are right. So there's a number of services, and these are all the ones offered by PowerSchool. These are the ones that I know the best. Sure, I'm sure there's other vendors that can do it, and as I said, you can do it yourself. But whatever you do, make sure you ask these questions and make sure that you really are protecting the data. For more information, you can talk to the folks at sales. Now, no insult, but the folks at sales won't really tell you a whole lot, at least when it comes to technology. But the good thing is, they have our email addresses. So they can come talk to us. Or you can come by and see me later. I'll be here all day. We'll be at the reception a little later. So I look forward to meeting you and talking with you. You know, I go to conferences and retreats just like you do, either conferences like this or maybe men's retreats at my church or whatever. And I come away from them overwhelmed. Matt talked about this a little before, where there are so many things that we need to change. I go to a men's retreat and I'm like, oh man, I'm messing up in so many ways. But a few years ago, a good friend of mine gave me some advice, and I love this advice. He said, Gary, don't try to fix everything at once. If you do, you're just going to fail. He said, pick one thing or a small number of things and commit to seeing them through. Commit to taking care of them. And then once you do that, do it again. Pick something else. Now, I love that advice. I've used it myself. I've given it to my kids when they've gone to retreats or whatever. And now I'm passing it on to you. You'll see a lot of things here. I'm really looking forward to seeing the network penetration testing that's going to be done here in just a little while. But pick one or two things and really decide, yeah, I'm going to see this thing through to the end. I'm really going to take care of it. This is you, standing up against an irresistible foe, apparently an irresistible foe. The biggest threat to all of our children's safety and privacy. And just like the tank man, because of your boldness, you're here You could be sitting at home, but you're here wanting to learn more to come up against this foe. Because of your boldness, other people will benefit. You're standing up against the irresistible foe. You're the hero here. But remember, PowerSchool will be standing right next to you. Thank you for your time.